As you can see, we have various sources about women and goddesses in prehistory, and I want you to get a sense that interpretation is really important. Archaeology is one of those sources, symbols, the oral tradition, and then, of course, literary evidence. These are all sources of information on goddesses in prehistory. The next few slides derive from Marianne Ferguson's Women and Religion text published in 1994. I actually suspect that this course was created around that text, but it's so out of date now, and the conversation around goddesses in in prehistory have evolved in very dramatic ways, as I think you're going to easily see as we go along. I felt it necessary to choose a new text as the framework of our study this semester. But Ferguson's chapter 1 is an introduction to early goddess cultures. Now you got that to some extent, especially in Rosemary Radford Ruther's chapter, and please feel free to read any more of that you want. But I want you to see how another major thinker, in this case Ferguson, in this field, framed the issues in that time period and her time period, so that you can get a sense of how the conversation has moved on and what exactly is at stake in those conversations for interpreting religion and in understanding the experiences of women in the context of religion. Some of the archaeological sources include pictures on cave and temple walls, burial grounds, temple items, objects that have been found inside of structures identified as temples or sacred, some sort of sacred rooms. Also female statues that seem to be predominant in prehistory. We also look at symbols because it's possible to see an object of veneration reflected in a culture's symbols. So if we see a giant image of a woman giving birth, we can assume to some extent that women are important in that society, at least for their biological functions. The oral tradition generally answers some pressing concern or question, and usually fall into at least these three general categories, and I've defined those for you here. Cosmogony is a theory explaining the creation of the universe. Eschatology is a theory explaining what happens after we die, how salvation is obtained after we die. And then theodicy is a theory explaining the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why do good people suffer? Those kinds of questions. That's called theodicy. In addition, these types of theories or myths often take the form of alienation myths, which are stories that explain the loss of an ideal state. And the Genesis story is one that many of us are familiar with. It's a great example of a cosmogonic story because it explains how the world came to be and how, beings came to be created. But it's also an alienation myth because it explains how human beings were alienated from God in the Garden of Eden. Literary evidence is also important. Written works like poems and recorded myths are symbolic indicators of what's important in a society. For the next few slides, I'd like you to simply click on the links and explore to whatever depth you're comfortable exploring these particular goddess figures. And now I'd like you to watch this film, Zeus, King of the Gods, to get some sense of how gods and goddesses, at least in the Western tradition, in one Western mythological tradition, how gods and goddesses related to. As you can see, Zeus has symbols that evoke images of power, like the thunderbolt. It meant all-powerful. It meant creator or divine weapon. The eagle meant the cup-bearer of the gods. Now Hera, on the other hand, was associated with, quote, feminine symbols, like the pomegranate. In Egypt, that meant prosperity and ambition. In Greece, it meant cycle of the seasons, life and death. The peacock feather meant the vault of heaven and the eyes of the stars. And then her tiara symbolized authority, her authority as a goddess. However, as you can see, these are not necessarily authoritative kinds of, or powerful kinds of symbols, right? It's not the same thing as divine weapon, creator, all-powerful, right? So she may have been associated with authority, but it wasn't certainly the same kind of authority that Zeus had. Similarly, Poseidon is associated with the bull, which symbolizes virility. He was associated with the trident, which symbolized earthshaker, stirring of the seas. And dolphin was the messenger of the gods. While Amphitrite, his wife, or Amphitrite, is associated with these things like nets in her hair, crab pinchers on her temples. She was once a sea goddess, obviously, right? And she eventually became a consort of Poseidon. But as a consort of Poseidon, then her status got reduced. She was no longer just a goddess in her own right who was powerful and controlled the seas. She was reduced to a mere representation of the sea. So you get a hint then at how language, in this case poetry, has a huge impact on those who consume it. It changes reality for those who read it. So how she got changed then from being this powerful goddess figure out in the sea, she became eventually people began imaging her as being enthroned beside Poseidon. She was riding in a chariot beside Poseidon. And so, in other words, we could say that she was diminished by disappearing or by disappearance. So what I hope you get is that by changing the meaning of symbols, we change the status of the deity. And if you want, feel free to click on these links. They're very interesting pieces about the Minoan state goddess and about Eve and the identity of women. So if you can only click on one, click on Eve and the identity of women. It's very interesting.